There are places in Tennessee where the mountains seem to hold their breath, where the fog doesn't burn off even when the sun climbs high, and the valleys between ridges swallow sound like water into stone. The Cumberland Plateau is one of those places, a wilderness of sandstone cliffs and tangled hardwood forests stretching across the eastern part of the state, beautiful and indifferent, where hikers disappear into green silence every weekend, and most of them come back out again by sunset. Most of them. Rebecca Hartwell loved those trails. She'd moved to Crossville 3 years earlier, taking a teaching position at Cumberland Elementary, and every Thursday afternoon, when school let out early, she'd drive her silver Honda Civic to one of the trailheads scattered along Highway 68. She'd lace up her boots, shoulder a small backpack with water and a granola bar, and walk into the woods alone. Her colleagues knew this. Her landlord knew this. Even the clerk at the gas station where she always filled up on her way out of town knew this. Becca was a creature of habit, they'd say later, when the questions started coming. Predictable, reliable, the kind of woman who showed up on time, graded papers on Sunday evenings, and never missed a parent-teacher conference. On October 7th, 2004, she didn't come home. Her landlord, Mrs. Dotson, noticed first. Becca rented a small duplex on Lantana Road, and every evening around 6, she'd hear the Honda pull into the gravel driveway, hear the screen door creak open, hear the television click on to the local news. Thursday evening came and went. The driveway stayed empty. Mrs. Dotson wasn't the worrying type, but by Friday morning, when Becca's car still hadn't returned, she called the school. The secretary said Becca hadn't shown up for work. No call, no explanation. That wasn't like her. That wasn't like her at all. By Friday afternoon, a Cumberland County Sheriff's deputy was driving the back roads near the hiking trails, checking parking areas. He found the Honda just before 4 o'clock, sitting alone at the old Stage Road trailhead, a narrow pullout barely wide enough for 3 vehicles, hemmed in by oak and hickory and the encroaching dusk. The engine was cold by then, but the driver's door hung partially open, and when the deputy approached with his hand near his sidearm, he saw her purse on the passenger seat, her cell phone in the cup holder, her keys still in the ignition. The driver's seat was pushed back farther than it should have been for someone Becca's height. That detail would stick with him for years. The initial search began that same evening, before the light failed completely. Sheriff's deputies and volunteer firefighters walked the trail in a loose line, calling her name, their voices flattening against the dense canopy. The old Stage Road trail wasn't particularly challenging, a 4-mile loop that climbed gradually along a ridge before descending back toward the trailhead through a creek valley. Popular with locals, well marked, the kind of hike you could finish in 2 hours and still be home for dinner. But the forest here was old growth in places, thick with undergrowth and limestone sinkholes hidden beneath layers of leaf litter. Easy to lose your footing, easy to wander off trail if you weren't paying attention. They found nothing that first night. Saturday morning brought reinforcements. The Tennessee Emergency Management Agency sent a search and rescue coordinator, and by midday, more than 40 people were combing the woods in grid patterns, dogs straining at their leashes, handlers shouting commands that echoed through the hollows. The weather had turned. A cold front pushed in from the northwest, bringing low clouds and a fine mist that clung to everything, soaking through jackets and turning the trail to mud. The dogs seemed confused, circling back on themselves, whining at their handlers. One of the search coordinators, a man named Dale Pritchard, who'd been doing this kind of work for 15 years, would later describe it as the strangest behavior he'd ever seen from trained tracking animals. They'd get about half a mile up the trail and just stop, he said in an interview years later, his voice careful, measured, wouldn't go forward, wouldn't sit. Just stood there, hackles up, staring into the trees like something was watching them back. On Sunday they found the boot. A volunteer searcher, a local high school biology teacher named Martin Keyes, spotted it near Cane Creek, almost 2 miles northeast of the trailhead, in an area that wasn't even on the official trail map. The creek ran narrow and cold through a ravine choked with rhododendron and fallen timber, a place where the sunlight barely reached even at noon. The boot was half submerged in the muddy bank, laces still tied, the teal and grey pattern matching the description Becca's landlord had given. Martin called out, and within minutes the searchers converged, cameras clicking, evidence bags rustling. But it was what surrounded the boot that made people go quiet. The ground was disturbed in a wide radius, leaves torn up, small saplings snapped at chest height, and deeper in the mud, a series of impressions that didn't match anything the searchers recognized. Too large for a dog, too elongated for a bear, with what looked like claw marks dragging at the front of each print. The spacing was wrong too, not the rhythmic gait of a four-legged animal, but something more erratic, almost bipedal in places. A wildlife officer from the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency knelt beside the prints for a long time, taking photographs, measuring with a tape measure, his expression unreadable. "Could be a black bear," he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe a big one. They'll rear up sometimes, walk on their hind legs if they're curious or aggressive." Nobody asked why a bear would have taken only one boot. 20 feet from the creek, they found the tree. An old hickory, trunk thick as a barrel, bark scarred with 4 parallel gouges that ran vertically for almost 3 feet, starting at a height of 9 feet and dragging downward. The marks were deep, cutting through the outer bark into the pale wood beneath, and they were fresh, sap still weeping from the wounds, wood chips scattered on the ground below. One of the volunteer firefighters, a man who'd grown up hunting these mountains, ran his fingers along the gouges and shook his head. "I've seen bear claws on trees," he said quietly. "This ain't that. Bears claw upward when they mark territory. This is something coming down. And it's too high. No bear I've ever seen could reach that high unless it was standing on something." There was nothing to stand on. The ground beneath the tree was level, undisturbed, except for the scattered wood chips and a patch of dried leaves that looked as though they'd been blown outward in a circle, radiating from the base of the trunk. The search intensified. More volunteers arrived, more dogs, more law enforcement. They found Becca's eyeglasses 30 feet further upstream, one lens cracked, the frames bent as though they'd been stepped on. They found a torn piece of teal fabric snagged on a blackberry bramble. They found boot prints in the mud, her size, her tread pattern, leading away from the creek and then vanishing abruptly on a stretch of exposed limestone where nothing left a track. They did not find Rebecca Hartwell. By Monday, the media had arrived. News vans from Nashville and Knoxville parked along Highway 68. Reporters doing stand-ups with the misty forest as a backdrop, asking questions that nobody could answer. The story spread quickly. Young woman, schoolteacher, vanished on a popular trail in broad daylight. The Nashville Tennessean ran it on the front page. Missing person flyers went up in every gas station and diner within 50 miles. Becca's smiling face above the words, "Have you seen her?" in bold red letters. The investigation pivoted. Sheriff's detectives began interviewing everyone who'd been near the trailhead that Thursday. A retired couple from Cookville had parked there around 2 in the afternoon, planning a short walk before the weather turned. They remembered seeing the silver Honda, they said, but no sign of the driver. The trail had been empty, unusually so for an October afternoon. Quiet. The husband, a man named Gordon Brill, used that word several times during his interview. "Too quiet," he clarified. "No birds, no squirrels. We commented on it, actually. My wife said it felt like the woods were holding their breath." They'd walked less than a mile before turning back. Something about the atmosphere unsettled them, though neither could articulate exactly what. The air felt heavier, they said. The shadows deeper. At one point, Gordon thought he heard footsteps behind them on the trail, but when he turned around, nobody was there. Just the empty path and the trees pressing close on either side. A local man, a hunting guide named Travis Kemp, came forward on Tuesday with a story that made the detectives exchange glances. He'd been scouting deer sign in the woods east of Cane Creek on Thursday afternoon, maybe a quarter-mile from where Becker's boot would eventually be found. Around 3 o'clock, he heard something moving through the undergrowth, something large, pushing through the rhododendron with a heavy, deliberate rhythm. He'd assumed it was a deer at first, maybe a buck establishing territory before the rut. But the sound was wrong, too slow, too purposeful. And then he'd heard something else, something that made him freeze with his rifle half raised. A voice, a woman's voice. Not words exactly, but a sound, a short, sharp cry that cut off almost as soon as it started. "I called out," Travis told the detectives, his hands clasped tight on the interview table. "Asked if someone needed help. Nothing. Dead silence. I mean nothing, not even wind. I walked toward where I thought the sound came from, and I found—" He hesitated. "I found footprints, big ones, in the mud near a sinkhole, and I found this." He pulled a plastic bag from his jacket pocket. Inside was a torn piece of fabric, teal with a mud stain along one edge. The detective sent it to the lab. It matched Becker's windbreaker. Travis described the footprints as the strangest thing he'd ever seen in 30 years of hunting. Large, deeper at the front than the back, with what looked like claw marks extending several inches beyond the main impression. The stride length was too long for a human, he said, maybe 4 feet between prints, and the pattern suggested something that moved in a crouch, low to the ground, but capable of sudden bursts of speed. He'd taken a photograph with a disposable camera, and when the film was developed, the image showed exactly what he'd described. A single, clear print in the mud, surrounded by disturbed leaves and broken twigs, with no other tracks leading to or from it. "It's like whatever made it just appeared there," Travis said, "and then disappeared again." The detectives asked the obvious question, could it have been a person? Someone walking on their toes or wearing some kind of modified footwear? Travis shook his head slowly. "I've tracked men through these woods before. Poachers, lost hikers, a fugitive once. This wasn't a man. The weight distribution was wrong. The depth of the print. You'd have to be carrying 300 pounds to sink that deep into soil that firm. And the spacing, the way it moved." He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "I've never seen anything move like that." The FBI got involved on Wednesday. Special agents from the Knoxville field office took over the case, bringing cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar and a level of procedural efficiency that made the local sheriff's department both grateful and slightly resentful. They rewalked every inch of the search grid. They interviewed Becker's family, her parents in Murfreesboro, her younger brother in Memphis, and found no evidence of foul play, no arguments or debts or secret relationships that might explain a voluntary disappearance. They pulled her phone records, her bank statements, her email account. Everything pointed to a woman who'd simply gone for a hike and never come back. The FBI brought in a forensic anthropologist to examine the claw marks on the hickory tree. Dr. Sarah Lindstrom, a specialist in wildlife interactions, spent an entire afternoon at the site, taking measurements, collecting samples of the damaged bark, comparing the marks to a database of known animal sign. Her report was cautious, hedged with qualifications, but the conclusion was unavoidable. The marks didn't match any native species in Tennessee, too deep for a bobcat, too narrow for a bear, too high for anything that walked on 4 legs. "If I had to guess," she told the lead investigator, "I'd say these were made by something climbing, something large and agile that came down the tree head first. But we don't have any animals in this region capable of that kind of descent pattern. Not at that weight class." When pressed, she added, "or it's something we haven't documented." The search continued for 2 weeks. Volunteers dwindled as the days grew colder, and the chances of finding Becker alive approached 0. The media coverage faded, replaced by other stories, other tragedies. The FBI agents returned to Knoxville, leaving behind file boxes and unanswered questions. The sheriff's department kept the case open, but resources were limited, and eventually the active investigation wound down to occasional follow-ups and dead-end tips called in by people who thought they'd seen a woman matching Becca's description at a truck stop in Kentucky or a bus station in Georgia. Rebecca Hartwell became a statistic, another missing person in a national database of thousands, her face on outdated flyers that curled at the edges in gas station windows, fading slowly in the sunlight. But the people who'd been there, who'd searched those woods and seen those prints and felt that silence pressing down like a weight, they didn't forget. They didn't talk about it much, not openly, but in quiet conversations over coffee or beer, in whispered exchanges at church socials or high school football games, the story persisted. Something had happened to Becca Hartwell in those woods. Something that left behind just enough evidence to ask questions, but not enough to provide answers. And sometimes, late at night when the fog rolled thick through the hollows and the trees creaked in the wind, people who lived near the Cumberland Plateau would stand at their windows and wonder what else might be out there, moving through the darkness with footsteps too heavy to be human and too deliberate to be animal, wondering if they were alone. Were those just the sounds of the forest? Or something we can't explain? The years that followed moved like water over stone, slowly, relentlessly, wearing everything down to smoother edges. The investigation into Rebecca Hartwell's disappearance never officially closed, but it faded into the background noise of small-town life, filed away in metal cabinets at the Cumberland County Sheriff's Office, alongside other cold cases that nobody wanted to think about too much. Her parents aged visibly, making the drive from Murfreesree to Crossville every October 7th to stand at the old Stage Road trailhead and leave flowers that wilted in the autumn rain. Her brother stopped returning reporters' calls. Her colleagues at Cumberland Elementary planted a dogwood tree in her memory outside the front entrance, a small bronze plaque reading Rebecca Hartwell, 1975-2004, beloved teacher, even though nobody had found a body, even though there was no death certificate, only an absence that grew heavier with each passing year. But some people couldn't let it go. Dale Pritchard, the search and rescue coordinator who'd led the initial effort, kept a file folder in his home office labeled simply Hartwell. Inside were copies of every report, every photograph, every interview transcript from the case. He'd retired from active fieldwork in 2008, but he still hiked the Cumberland Plateau trails regularly, sometimes with his dog, sometimes alone, always carrying a camera and a notebook. He documented things that most people wouldn't notice: trees with unusual scarring, patterns of broken branches too high for deer browse, areas where the undergrowth seemed deliberately cleared in rough circles 12 to 15 feet across. He took soil samples from places where the dogs had refused to track, sent them to a friend at the University of Tennessee for informal analysis. The results were always inconclusive. Elevated mineral content in some areas, unusual pH levels in others. Nothing that screamed evidence, but enough anomalies to keep him coming back. In the spring of 2007, Dale found something that made him call the sheriff's office for the first time in 2 years. He'd been hiking a trail about 6 miles north of where Becca disappeared, following Duskin Creek into a remote section of the plateau where old logging roads dissolved into game trails and the forest felt older, darker, less touched by human presence. The creek ran shallow over limestone shelves, and in one of the deeper pools, wedged between 2 rocks where the current had deposited it, Dale found a backpack. Small, forest green, the fabric rotted and bleached by sun and water, the zippers corroded shut. He pulled it carefully from the creek, water streaming from the seams, and on the inside flap, barely legible beneath layers of grime and algae, he found a name written in faded permanent marker, R. Hartwell. The sheriff's deputy who responded was young, new to the department, but he'd heard the stories. He bagged the backpack and drove it to the forensics lab in Nashville himself, hand-delivered it to a technician who'd worked the original case. Inside, preserved by the waterproof inner lining, they found a soggy granola bar wrapper, a trail map of the Cumberland Plateau disintegrating into pulp, and a spiral notebook with page after page of nature sketches, birds, leaves, rock formations, all rendered in careful pencil lines that had survived the water damage in ghost-like impressions. The last page, the only one with writing instead of drawings, contained a single sentence in Becca's handwriting, the words smudged but readable. Something followed me from Raven Point. Heard it in the trees. Going home early. The entry was dated October 7th, 2004. Raven Point was a scenic overlook 8 miles east of the old Stage Road trailhead, accessible by a different trail system entirely. The new information opened questions that nobody had thought to ask before. If Becca had been at Raven Point that afternoon, why was her car found at Old Stage Road? Had she hiked between the two locations? That would have been a strenuous cross-country trek through some of the roughest terrain on the plateau, the kind of route only experienced backpackers would attempt, and certainly not something you'd do on a Thursday afternoon, planning to be home by dinner. Had someone moved her car? Had she moved it herself, trying to escape something that was following her? Had she been running? The sheriff's department sent a team back to Raven Point. The overlook sat at the edge of a sandstone cliff that dropped away 200 feet to a boulder field below, offering views across the rolling green expanse of the Cumberland forest that stretched to the horizon like a frozen ocean. The trail leading to it was narrow, overgrown in places, marked with faded blazes on trees that had been painted years ago and never maintained. At the trailhead parking area, they found the rusted frame of a sign that read, "Trail closed. Erosion hazard," the post leaning at a steep angle, the warning long ignored by hikers who came for the view. The investigation team hiked in with dogs, with metal detectors, with a renewed sense of purpose that felt both hopeful and desperately late. They found beer cans and cigarette butts and the usual detritus of human visitation. They found fire pits where campers had stayed illegally overnight. They found graffiti carved into trees, initials and dates going back decades. And they found, at the very edge of the overlook where the rock shelf crumbled away into empty air, a pattern of scratches in the sandstone that made the lead investigator stand motionless for a long time, just staring. The scratches formed rough, parallel lines, 4 of them, each about an inch wide and 6 inches long, carved deep into the stone, as if something with immense strength had dragged claws across solid rock. The pattern repeated twice, once near the cliff edge and once about 3 feet back, both sets angled toward the drop-off. A geologist from Tennessee Tech, who examined the site later, said the marks were recent. Within the last few years, certainly, possibly within the last few months. Sandstone eroded quickly in Tennessee's wet climate, and these marks showed minimal weathering. Something with significant force made these, the geologist said, running a gloved hand over the grooves. We're talking thousands of pounds of pressure concentrated in a small area. Could be climbing equipment, a metal grappling hook maybe, if someone was rappelling here illegally. Could be machinery, some kind of excavation tool, or, he hesitated, or something biological, with keratin-based claws strong enough to score rock, which would require an animal substantially larger and more powerful than anything known to inhabit this region. When pressed for specifics, he shrugged. I'm a geologist, not a zoologist, but if I found these marks on a cliff face in Montana or Alberta, I'd be thinking grizzly bear. Except we haven't had grizzlies in Tennessee for over 100 years. The team searched the area around Raven Point for 2 days, expanding their radius to include the ravines and hollows that branched away from the overlook in every direction. They found a deer carcass in an advanced state of decomposition, the bones scattered across a wide area in a pattern that the wildlife officer described as inconsistent with typical scavenger behavior. The spine had been separated from the ribcage with what looked like tremendous force. Vertebrae snapped cleanly, and the skull was missing entirely. Tufts of deer hair were found in trees 10 feet off the ground, snagged on branches as if the carcass had been carried through the canopy. They found more footprints, similar to the ones found near Becker's boot 3 years earlier, large, deep, with claw marks extending from elongated toe impressions. These were fresher, preserved in a patch of wet clay near a seep spring. A wildlife forensics expert from the University of Georgia made the trip to Tennessee to examine them, took plaster casts, compared them to every known species in the southeastern United States. His report was careful, academic, and ultimately unsatisfying. The prints show characteristics of both plantigrade and digitigrade locomotion, he wrote. The depth and spacing suggest an animal weighing between 250 and 400 pounds, moving at a walking pace. The claw marks are consistent with a large predator, but the toe configuration doesn't match any extant species in North America. Without additional evidence, hair samples, scat, direct observation, I cannot make a definitive identification. Off the record, in a conversation with Dale Pritchard over coffee in Crossville, the expert was more candid. I've been doing this for 20 years, he said quietly. I've identified tracks from every animal on this continent, and some from other continents that people keep as exotic pets and then release when they get too dangerous. These don't match anything I've seen. The closest analogue would be a prehistoric ground sloth, but those have been extinct for 10,000 years. So either we're dealing with an unknown species, which seems unlikely in a region this heavily studied, or we're dealing with something that doesn't leave consistent tracks. Something that's adaptable. What do you mean, adaptable? Dale asked. The expert stirred his coffee, choosing words carefully. I mean, maybe it's not always the same. Maybe the tracks change because the thing making them changes. Or maybe there's more than one of whatever it is. Or maybe... He shook his head. Maybe I've been looking at too many plaster casts and I'm starting to see patterns that aren't there. But Dale knew that look. He'd seen it on his own face in the mirror often enough. The look of someone who'd encountered something that didn't fit into the neat categories of known and unknown, natural and unnatural, real and imagined. Something that existed in the space between explanations, too strange to dismiss and too elusive to confirm. The discovery of Becker's backpack reignited media interest briefly. A reporter from Nashville wrote a feature story titled The Cumberland Mystery, What Happened to Rebecca Hartwell, that ran in the Sunday Tennessean and was picked up by several regional papers. The story summarized the known facts, interviewed Becker's parents and former colleagues, and included speculation from various experts about what might have occurred. The theories ranged from the plausible, Becker fell from the cliff at Raven Point and her body was never recovered, to the unlikely, she was abducted by a stranger who left no trace, to the frankly bizarre, she encountered an undocumented predator species surviving in the remote sections of the Cumberland Plateau. That last theory generated surprising interest. Internet forums dedicated to cryptozoology and unexplained phenomena seized on the case, dissecting every detail, comparing the evidence to reports from other regions where hikers had vanished under similar circumstances. The Pacific Northwest had its stories, the Appalachian Mountains had theirs, now Tennessee had one too. The forums filled with speculation about what people called wild men, or forest giants, or simply the thing in the woods, a creature that supposedly lived in the deepest, least accessible parts of the American wilderness, avoiding human contact, leaving behind just enough evidence to fuel legends, but never enough to prove its existence. Most law enforcement officials dismissed this speculation as unhelpful noise, but a few found themselves reading those forum posts late at night, clicking through grainy photographs and blurry videos and first-hand accounts from people who claimed to have encountered something in the forests that defied classification. Dale Pritchard printed out some of the more credible reports, added them to his Hartwell file, and tried not to think too hard about the patterns he was starting to see. In 2009, another hiker went missing on the Cumberland Plateau. His name was Jason Ridley, a 23-year-old from Chattanooga who'd driven up on a Saturday morning in late September to hike the Brady Mountain Trail. His truck was found at the trailhead 2 days later, keys in the ignition, wallet in the glove box, his hiking gear still in the back seat. Search teams deployed immediately, and this time, the dogs tracked for almost 4 miles before losing the scent near a place locals called Devil's Kitchen, a sinkhole complex where the plateau's limestone substrate had collapsed into a series of interconnected caves and pit openings hidden beneath layers of rhododendron and mountain laurel. The searchers found Jason's baseball cap near one of the sinkhole entrances, and they found something else, markings on the trees surrounding the site that made even the most skeptical deputies pause. Entire sections of bark stripped away in vertical lines, exposing pale wood underneath, as if something had systematically marked a perimeter around the sinkhole. The marks were fresh, sap still oozing, and they extended in a rough circle encompassing nearly an acre of forest. Inside that circle, the undergrowth was trampled flat, and the air carried a smell that several searchers commented on, a thick, musty odor like wet fur mixed with something metallic and vaguely rotten. The dogs wouldn't enter the circle. They pulled against their leashes, whining, backing away with their ears flat. One handler, frustrated, tried to drag his German Shepherd forward, and the animal panicked, twisting out of its collar and bolting back down the trail. Jason Ridley was never found. The search lasted a week before being scaled back, then suspended, then quietly closed. The sheriff's department added his case to the file next to Rebecca Hartwell's, and people started talking about the Cumberland Plateau differently. Parents stopped letting their teenagers hike alone. Trail usage dropped noticeably. The State Park Service posted new signs at trailheads: hike in groups, carry communication devices, report unusual animal activity. But they didn't say what kind of unusual activity hikers should be watching for, because nobody could quite put it into words. Dale Pritchard hiked to Devil's Kitchen 6 months after Jason disappeared. He went alone, against every safety recommendation, carrying a high-quality camera and a voice recorder and a growing conviction that he was looking for something that didn't want to be found. The sinkhole area was quiet when he arrived, a cathedral-like silence broken only by the drip of water into the caves below. The trees still bore their stripped bark, though weathering had dulled the exposed wood to grey. The undergrowth had begun growing back, green shoots pushing through the trampled earth. Dale walked the perimeter slowly, documenting everything, and near the northern edge of the clearing, he found a tree that made him stop breathing for a moment. A massive oak, trunk 4 feet across, with a section of bark peeled away at a height of 8 feet to reveal wood underneath that had been deliberately scored with deep parallel gouges, the same pattern he'd seen on the hickory near Becker's Boot, on the sandstone at Raven Point, on a dozen trees scattered across the plateau over the years. But this time, the marks formed something almost like a shape. Not writing, nothing that organized, but lines that suggested intention. A warning, maybe. Or a claim. He took photographs from every angle, measured the marks with a tape measure, collected wood samples in plastic bags, and as he worked, he became aware of a feeling that he'd experienced before in these woods, the sensation of being watched. Not the casual awareness of wildlife presence that any experienced hiker learns to recognize, but something heavier, more focused. The feeling of eyes on the back of your neck. The certainty that something large and intelligent was observing your every movement, calculating, deciding. Dale turned slowly, scanning the forest around him. Nothing, just trees and shadows and the dying light of afternoon filtering through the canopy. But the feeling persisted, strong enough that he put his hand on the canister of bear spray clipped to his belt. Strong enough that he backed away from the marked tree, keeping his eyes on the forest, and didn't turn his back until he was 100 yards down the trail. He didn't hike alone on the plateau after that. The years continued to pass, 2010, 2011, 2012. The Hartwell case became one of those local legends that people mentioned when the subject of unsolved mysteries came up, usually late at night around campfires or in the back booths of diners. Stories traded like currency among those who'd lived in the area long enough to remember when it happened. New people moved to Crossville, people who'd never heard of Rebecca Hartwell or Jason Ridley, and they hiked the trails without the shadow of those disappearances hanging over them. The forest continued its ancient work of growing and dying and growing again, indifferent to human concerns, keeping its secrets in the deep places where sunlight never quite reached. And then, in the autumn of 2019, a man named Derek Hollis confessed to murdering his girlfriend, and everything people thought they knew about what happened on the Cumberland Plateau 15 years earlier was thrown into question. Could a single confession really explain everything? Or was there more to the story than anyone imagined? Derek Hollis wasn't from Tennessee. He'd grown up in rural Kentucky, outside a town called Hazard, the kind of place where coal mines closed and never reopened, where young men learned early that staying meant accepting a slow fade into obscurity. He'd worked construction jobs across 3 states, moved from one trailer park to another, lived with a series of girlfriends who eventually left him, citing his temper, his drinking, the way he'd disappear for days without explanation. By 2019, he was 47 years old, living alone in a single wide trailer outside Sparta, Tennessee, about 30 miles from Crossville, surviving on disability payments from a back injury and whatever cash he could make doing odd jobs for people who didn't ask too many questions. In September of that year, his girlfriend, a woman named Crystal Mays, disappeared. Crystal was 29, worked at a Dollar General in Cookeville, and had been seeing Derek for about 8 months. Long enough for her friends to start worrying, short enough that she hadn't moved in with him yet. She told her co-workers that Derek was complicated, that he had demons he was working through, that underneath the rough exterior he was actually sweet. They told her to be careful. They told her they'd seen this movie before, and it never ended well. On September 14th, Crystal didn't show up for her shift. Her manager called her cell phone, got voicemail, tried again the next day with the same result. By the 3rd day, concerned, the manager called the police. White County Sheriff's deputies went to Derek's trailer. He answered the door, shirtless, squinting against the afternoon sun, and told them he hadn't seen Crystal in over a week. They'd had a fight, he said. She'd left. He assumed she'd gone back to her mother's place in Livingston. The deputies asked if they could look around, and Derek, after a long pause that felt heavier than it should have, stepped aside and let them in. The trailer was a disaster. Dishes piled in the sink, empty beer cans covering every surface, clothes and tools and old newspapers scattered across the floor. But in the bedroom, underneath a pile of laundry, the deputies found a woman's purse. Inside was Crystal's ID, her debit card, her car keys. Derek's explanation was that she must have forgotten it, must have been in a hurry when she left, but his hands were shaking when he said it, and his eyes kept darting to the bedroom window, and the deputies decided to bring him in for questioning. In the interview room at the White County Sheriff's Office, under fluorescent lights that made everyone look sick and tired, Derek held out for 3 hours. He maintained that Crystal had left on her own, that he didn't know where she'd gone, that he'd never hurt her. But the detectives had checked with Crystal's mother. They'd checked with her friends, her co-workers, her bank account. Nobody had heard from her. She hadn't used her debit card. Her car, a 10-year-old Toyota Corolla, was still parked at Derek's trailer. And when the detectives mentioned that they were going to search the property more thoroughly, maybe bring in cadaver dogs, maybe tear up the floorboards in the trailer if they had to, Derek's composure cracked. "I didn't mean to," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. She wouldn't stop yelling. She was in my face, saying I was worthless, saying she was going to leave, take all her stuff and I'd never see her again. Something just snapped. He confessed to strangling her during an argument. He confessed to panicking afterward, wrapping her body in a tarp, loading it into the back of his truck. And then he said something that made the detectives sit forward in their chairs. "I took her to the woods, the Cumberland Plateau. I knew those trails, used to hunt up there years ago. Nobody goes into the deep parts, the places without marked paths. I carried her in, couple miles off the trail, and I buried her in a ravine where nobody'd ever find her." The detectives asked which trail. Derek described a location that made the lead investigator reach for his phone. "Near Old Stage Road?" the detective asked. "Near Cane Creek?" Derek nodded. "Yeah, around there. It's all connected up in those mountains. I didn't know the name of the trail exactly. I just drove until I found a parking area that was empty, and I went in from there." The detective left the room, made a call to the Cumberland County Sheriff's Office, and within an hour the name Rebecca Hartwell was on everyone's lips again. Derek claimed he'd buried Crystal's body sometime around September 15th, 2019, but when pressed, he became vague about details. He couldn't remember exactly where he'd parked. He couldn't describe the trail with any specificity. He said it had been dark, late at night, and he'd been in a panic, just wanting to get rid of the body and get back home. But then, almost as an afterthought, he said, this wasn't the first time. The interview room went silent. The detective's pen stopped moving across his notepad. From behind the one-way glass, the other officers watching the interrogation exchanged glances. "What do you mean it wasn't the first time?" the detective asked carefully. Derek looked at his hands, clasped on the metal table. "There was another one, long time ago, 2004, I think. Maybe 2005. I was living in Crossville then, working construction on a new subdivision off Highway 70. Met a woman, a teacher. We went hiking a few times. She was..." He paused, searching for words. "She was too good for me. I knew it. She knew it. I got obsessed, started following her, showing up at her apartment uninvited. She told me to leave her alone. Said if I didn't stop, she'd get a restraining order." The detective's voice was very quiet. "What was her name?" "Rebecca," Derek said. "Rebecca Hartwell." The confession came out in pieces over the next 6 hours. Derek claimed that on October 7th, 2004, he'd followed Becca to the Old Stage Road trailhead, waited until she was deep enough into the forest that no one would hear, and then confronted her. They argued. She tried to get away from him. He grabbed her, and in the struggle, he said, she fell and hit her head on a rock. He panicked, moved her body deeper into the woods, tried to stage it to look like an animal attack by scattering her belongings and damaging a nearby tree with a hunting knife to create claw marks. Then he moved her car to make it look like she'd just arrived, like she'd gone hiking and never come back. "I didn't mean to kill her," he repeated several times. "It was an accident. But I knew nobody would believe that. I knew they'd think I was some kind of stalker who murdered her. So I made it look like something else happened." The confession was detailed, specific in some places, frustratingly vague in others. He described Becca's clothing accurately, the teal windbreaker, the jeans, the hiking boots. He knew details about the trailhead that weren't common knowledge. But when detectives asked him to show them where he'd buried the body, he couldn't. He said it had been 15 years. The forest changed. He didn't remember exactly. He could get them close, he said. He could show them the general area. The news broke on October 1st, 2019. "Arrest made in 2004, disappearance of Tennessee teacher," ran as the headline in the Tennessean, and within hours it was picked up nationally. Derek Hollis's booking photo appeared on television screens across the state. A haggard face with sunken eyes and grey stubble. The look of a man who'd been carrying heavy guilt for a long time. Becca's parents, now in their 70s, released a statement through their attorney expressing relief that someone had finally been held accountable. The Cumberland County Sheriff's Office held a press conference, carefully noting that the investigation was ongoing, that they were working to recover remains, that Derek faced charges of second-degree murder and abuse of a corpse. But behind the scenes, there were problems. Dale Pritchard, still keeping tabs on the case after all these years, was one of the first to voice concerns. He called the detective leading the investigation, a woman named Sarah Chen, who'd transferred to Cumberland County from Nashville and had only learned about the Hartwell case when Derek's confession came in. "Something's not right," Dale told her. "I was there. I led the initial search. The evidence we found doesn't match what he's describing." Detective Chen listened as Dale walked through the inconsistencies. The footprints near Becca's boot, too large, too strange to have been made by Derek Hollis, who wore a size 10 shoe and weighed maybe 180 pounds. The claw marks on the hickory tree, too deep, too high. Impossible to create with a hunting knife unless you were standing on a ladder, and Derek claimed he'd done it at night in a panic. The way the dogs had behaved during the search, refusing to track in certain areas, acting spooked in a way that experienced handlers said they'd never seen before. The torn fabric found by Travis Kemp, discovered in a location that would have required dragging or carrying a body through nearly impassable terrain. And then there was Becca's notebook, found in her backpack 6 miles from where Derek claimed everything happened, with her handwritten entry about something following her from Raven Point. Derek hadn't mentioned Raven Point at all, hadn't mentioned the backpack. When asked about it, he said he didn't remember a backpack. Maybe she hadn't been carrying one that day. Maybe his memory was fuzzy after 15 years. "He's lying," Dale said flatly. Maybe not about all of it. Maybe he did know Becca. Maybe they did have some kind of relationship or obsession on his part, but he didn't kill her. Or if he did, it didn't happen the way he's saying. Detective Chen had her own doubts. She'd interviewed Derek multiple times, trying to get him to clarify details, and his story kept shifting in small ways. The time of day changed. The location drifted. He'd say Becca fell and hit her head. Then later he'd say they struggled and he pushed her. Then later still he'd say it was an accident. She tripped while running away. His description of moving her body didn't account for the physical evidence. If he'd carried her to where the boot was found, there should have been drag marks, disturbed vegetation, some trace of passage. The search teams had been thorough. They'd found nothing that suggested human intervention. And then there was the question of Crystal Maze. Search teams had been combing the areas Derek described for 2 weeks, and they hadn't found any sign of recent burial. No disturbed earth, no scent traces the cadaver dogs could detect, no evidence that anyone had been digging in the locations Derek claimed to remember. When confronted with this, Derek became agitated, insisting he'd buried her. It had to be there. Maybe they weren't looking in the right spots. A forensic psychologist brought in to evaluate Derek's mental state wrote in her report, "Subject shows signs of possible false confession syndrome, characterized by a desire to claim responsibility for unsolved crimes in order to achieve notoriety or resolve internal guilt about unrelated actions. Alternately, subject may be confessing to murder in order to conceal a different crime or to protect someone else. Recommend further investigation before accepting confession at face value." Dies, but the prosecutor's office was under pressure. 2 missing women, 15 years apart, and finally someone willing to say he'd done it. The families wanted closure. The media wanted resolution. The case had already been tried and convicted in the court of public opinion before the forensic evidence could catch up. In November 2019, a team of forensic archaeologists and cadaver dog handlers returned to the Cumberland Plateau for an intensive search of the areas Derek had identified. They brought ground-penetrating radar, soil probes, infrared cameras. They sectioned off a grid pattern and searched every square foot methodically. Dale Pritchard volunteered to help, and Detective Chen, recognizing his experience and his intimate knowledge of the terrain, accepted. They found remains, not where Derek said they'd be, but close enough that the prosecutor could argue he'd simply misremembered the exact location. The bones were discovered in a sinkhole about a quarter mile from where Becca's boot had been recovered, buried under years of leaf litter and sediment, scattered by water flow and possibly animal activity. The forensic team carefully excavated the site, cataloguing every fragment, and when the remains were analyzed at the State Medical Examiner's office in Nashville, the results created more questions than they answered. The bones belonged to a female, approximately 25 to 30 years old at time of death, consistent with Rebecca Hartwell's age and build. Dental records would take weeks to confirm, but the preliminary assessment was positive. Cause of death was impossible to determine. Too much decomposition, too much damage from environmental factors. But the pattern of the skeletal remains told a story that made the forensic anthropologist conducting the examination hesitate before including it in his official report. The bones had been disarticulated, separated at the joints, in a way that suggested either very deliberate dismemberment or the action of a large predator. Tooth marks were visible on several bones, gouges that didn't match any known scavenger species in Tennessee. The skull showed trauma consistent with a massive blow to the back of the head, force sufficient to fracture the occipital bone and create a starburst pattern of cracks radiating outward. The medical examiner noted that such trauma would typically require either a high-velocity impact, like a fall from significant height, or a strike from an object or appendage capable of delivering several hundred pounds of pressure in a concentrated area. Could be consistent with being struck by a vehicle, the medical examiner wrote carefully, or falling from a substantial height onto a hard surface, or less likely, an attack by a large animal using paws or claws to deliver blunt force trauma. He didn't include in the official report what he told Detective Chen privately. I've examined remains from bear attacks, mountain lion attacks, even a case where someone was killed by an escaped tiger from a private zoo. This doesn't look like any of those. The force required to create this kind of cranial fracture is substantial. We're talking grizzly bear strength, maybe higher, and the tooth marks on the long bones. I can't identify them. The spacing is wrong. The depth is wrong. It's like something was trying to consume the remains but didn't have the right kind of teeth for it, so it just crushed and scraped. Crystal Mays's body was never found. Despite extensive searches, despite Derek's continued insistence that he'd buried her in the same general area, no trace of her turned up. The working theory became that Derek had disposed of her body somewhere else entirely, and the confession about the Cumberland Plateau was an attempt to link himself to the more famous Hartwell case, to achieve a kind of infamy. But some investigators, including Detective Chen and Dale Pritchard, began to suspect something different. They suspected that Derek Hollis had indeed known both women, had possibly obsessed over them, followed them, frightened them. But they didn't think he'd killed them. They thought he'd found the remains afterward, or heard about the disappearances, and constructed a confession that incorporated details from the real investigations. They thought he was confessing to feel important, to have control over something when his life had spiraled into insignificance. Or they thought he was confessing to cover up what he actually knew about what happened in those woods. In December 2019, Dale Pritchard made one final trip to the Cumberland Plateau before winter set in hard. He hiked alone to Raven Point, the place where Becca had written in her notebook about being followed. The overlook was dusted with early snow, the cliff edge crumbling and dangerous in the freezing temperatures. He stood where the claw marks had been found in the sandstone years earlier, now weathered almost to invisibility, and looked out across the forest, stretching to the horizon. He'd brought a trail camera with him, one of the motion-activated models that hunters use to monitor game. He mounted it on a tree facing the overlook, angled to capture anything that approached the cliff edge, and programmed it to take photographs and video whenever movement triggered the sensor. It was a long shot, he knew. 15 years after Becca's death, whatever had been here was likely gone, if it had ever been here at all. But Dale had spent too many years chasing shadows to walk away without trying one more thing. He checked the camera every 2 weeks through the winter and into the spring of 2020. Most of the images were unremarkable. deer, raccoons, the occasional hiker stopping to admire the view. But in early March, the camera captured something that made Dale sit at his kitchen table for an hour, just staring at the laptop screen, trying to decide if he was seeing what he thought he was seeing. The timestamp read 3:47 a.m. The image was grainy, illuminated by the camera's infrared flash, but clear enough to make out shapes. The overlook was empty except for a figure standing near the cliff edge, right where the claw marks had been found. The figure was tall, very tall, perhaps 7 feet or more, and broad across the shoulders, but the proportions were wrong for a human, too long in the arms, too thick through the torso. The infrared made it impossible to determine color or texture, rendering everything in shades of gray and white, but the figure appeared to be covered in something rough, perhaps hair or fur. It was turned away from the camera, facing the drop-off, and in the still image there was no way to tell if it was looking out at the forest or preparing to climb down the cliff face. The next image, captured 3 seconds later, when the motion sensor triggered again, showed the overlook empty, no figure, no sign that anything had been there at all. Dale enhanced the image as much as the software would allow, zooming in on the figure, trying to make out details. The more he looked, the less certain he became about what he was seeing. Could be a person in unusual clothing, perhaps a hunter in bulky winter gear who'd climbed up to the overlook in the middle of the night for reasons unknown. Could be a trick of shadow and infrared distortion, something perfectly ordinary, rendered strange by the camera's night vision. Could be image corruption, a glitch in the sensor, light reflecting oddly off snow or ice. Could be something else. He printed the image, added it to his file, and after a long internal debate, he sent a copy to Detective Chen with a brief note. Found this on my trail camera at Raven Point. Don't know what to make of it. Thought you should see. Chen called him the next day. What am I looking at, Dale? I don't know, he admitted, but it was there, or something was there, at the exact spot where we found those claw marks in the rock. There was a long silence on the phone. Finally, Chen said, Derek Hollis goes to trial in June. His defense attorney is planning to argue that his confession was coerced, that there's no physical evidence linking him to either crime, that the remains we found can't be definitively connected to his actions. If we introduce whatever this is into evidence, it's going to open doors that I don't think anyone wants opened. What if those doors need to be opened? Dale asked. Another silence. Then, what if some things are better left closed? The trial of Derek Hollis began on June 15, 2020, in a Cumberland County courtroom that had been hastily modified to allow for social distancing during the COVID-19 pandemic. The proceeding was surreal. Witnesses testifying from behind masks, the jury seated 6 feet apart, the defendant barely visible behind a plexiglass barrier. The prosecution presented Derek's confession, his prior relationship with Becca Hartwell, the remains found near where he'd indicated. The defense argued that the confession was unreliable, that Derek was mentally unstable, that he'd inserted himself into a famous cold case to feel important, and that the actual evidence suggested something far stranger than a simple murder. The defense attorney, a public defender named Marcus Webb, who'd taken the case pro bono because he genuinely believed Derek was innocent, made the risky decision to introduce alternative theories. He brought in the forensic anthropologist who'd examined Becca's remains and got him to admit on the stand that the trauma patterns were inconsistent with human agency. He introduced photographs of the claw marks, the oversized footprints, the stripped bark around the sinkhole where Jason Ridley had disappeared. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Webb said in his closing argument, "you have to decide what's more likely, that my client, a man with no history of violence, no physical evidence connecting him to these crimes, confessed because he's guilty, or that he confessed because he's a troubled individual who wanted attention, who wanted to believe he was important enough to have caused all this mystery and fear." And you have to ask yourselves another question. What if something else happened in those woods? Something that we don't want to acknowledge because it challenges everything we think we know about the world? The jury deliberated for 3 days. They came back with a verdict of not guilty on the murder charge due to insufficient evidence. Derek Hollis walked out of the courthouse a free man, though the stigma of the accusation would follow him for the rest of his life. And in the forests of the Cumberland Plateau, where the fog still rolled thick through the hollows and the trees kept their ancient watch, something moved through the shadows, unknown and unknowable, leaving behind only questions. Was justice truly served, or did the real answer remain hidden in the darkness? The acquittal of Derek Hollis sent ripples through Cumberland County that wouldn't settle for years. Some people believed he'd gotten away with murder through legal technicality and a defense attorney who'd exploited tragedy for spectacle. Others believed he'd been wrongly accused, scapegoated for crimes he didn't commit simply because he fit the profile of a man society was ready to condemn. And a smaller group, the ones who'd lived in the shadow of the plateau long enough to know its moods and mysteries, believed something else entirely. That Derek had confessed not because he was guilty, but because the truth was too strange to speak aloud, and claiming responsibility for murder was easier than admitting what he'd actually witnessed in those woods. Derek himself disappeared within weeks of the trial. He left the single-wide trailer in Sparta, left Tennessee altogether, and the last anyone heard, he was living somewhere in northern Florida, working at a marina, keeping to himself. He never gave interviews, never capitalized on his brief infamy. The few people who encountered him in the years after said he had the look of a man haunted not by what he'd done, but by what he knew and could never prove. Detective Sarah Chen stayed on the case even after the trial concluded. She couldn't let it go. The Hartwell investigation technically remained open. The remains found in the sinkhole had been positively identified through dental records as Rebecca Hartwell, but cause of death remained undetermined, and the evidence didn't support the prosecution's theory that Derek had killed her in a struggle and staged the scene. The case file grew thicker with reports that led nowhere, witness statements that contradicted each other, forensic analyses that raised more questions than they answered. And then there was Crystal Mays, still missing, still unaccounted for despite months of searching. Her family held out hope that she'd simply run away, started a new life somewhere far from Derek and his demons. But as the months turned into a year, and then 2 years with no contact, no social media activity, no electronic footprint of any kind, hope calcified into the hard certainty of loss. In the spring of 2021, Chen received a phone call from a park ranger working in the Big South Fork National River and Recreation Area, about 40 miles northeast of where Becca had disappeared. The ranger, a woman named Angela Torres, had been doing a routine patrol in a remote section of the park when she'd come across something disturbing. A campsite that looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry, tent torn open from the outside, camping gear scattered across a wide radius, and a pattern of large footprints in the mud near the creek that she couldn't identify. "I've worked in these parks for 12 years, Angela told Chen over the phone. "I know what black bear prints look like. I know elk. I know wild boar. These are none of those things. And there's—" She hesitated. "There's blood. Not a lot, but enough. On the tent fabric. On some of the scattered clothing. I think something attacked these campers, or chased them more. I don't know. But it wasn't natural. It wasn't normal." Chen drove out to Big South Fork the next morning, bringing Dale Pritchard with her. They hiked into the site with Angela, a 2-mile trek along a rocky trail that descended into a gorge, where the Big South Fork River cut through layers of ancient sandstone. The campsite was exactly as Angela had described, a scene of chaos and violence rendered all the more unsettling by the peaceful beauty of the surrounding forest. The morning sun filtered through new spring leaves, birds sang in the canopy, and the river murmured its endless song over stones worn smooth by millennia. The tent was a high-end backpacking model, lightweight nylon in forest green, with one side panel ripped completely away. The damage looked like it had been done by something with immense strength. The fabric hadn't been cut or torn along seams, but ripped straight through the reinforced sections, the poles bent and snapped. Inside the tent, 2 sleeping bags lay tangled and partially unzipped, as if the occupants had scrambled out in desperate haste. Personal items were scattered: a flashlight, a paperback novel, a bag of trail mix torn open with its contents spilled across the tent floor. Outside, the scene grew stranger. Camping gear lay distributed in a rough circle, extending 30 feet from the tent in all directions. A backpack hung from a tree branch 12 feet off the ground, its contents pulled out and dropped below: clothing, food packages, a water filter. A cooking pot sat in the cold remains of a campfire, the metal dented inward as if something had stepped on it with tremendous force. And everywhere, preserved in the soft mud near the creek, were the footprints. Dale knelt beside the clearest set, pulling out his tape measure with practiced efficiency. The prints measured 17 inches long and 7 inches wide at the broadest point, with 5 distinct toe impressions and what looked like claw marks extending 2 inches beyond each toe. The depth was extraordinary, nearly 3 inches in firm soil, suggesting enormous weight. The stride length between prints was close to 5 feet, and the pattern indicated bipedal locomotion, though with a gait unlike any human. "It's the same," Dale said quietly, looking up at Chen. "The same as what we found near Becker's Boot 17 years ago. The same as Raven Point, Devil's Kitchen, all of it. It's the same thing." Chen was already on her phone, calling for a forensic team. While they waited, Angela showed them something else she'd found. A tree about 50 yards from the campsite, a massive sycamore growing at the edge of the river. The trunk bore deep parallel gouges, starting at a height of 10 feet and running downward for nearly 4 feet, fresh enough that sap still wept from the wounds. And at the base of the tree, pressed into soft earth, was a single clear print that looked as though something had crouched there for a long time, watching the campsite from a distance before moving in. The forensic team arrived by early afternoon, bringing equipment up the trail in stages. They took plaster casts of the footprints, collected samples of the blood evidence, photographed and documented every detail of the scene. The blood analysis would take weeks, but the preliminary field test showed it was human blood, type O positive. DNA analysis would eventually confirm it belonged to 2 individuals, a male and a female, neither of whom had been reported missing. That detail troubled Chen more than almost anything else. 2 people had been at this campsite, possibly injured, possibly attacked by something, and nobody had reported them missing, which meant either they'd survived and left the area without seeking help, too frightened or traumatized to involve authorities, or they'd been taken somewhere, their disappearance not yet noticed by anyone who cared. A wider search of the area commenced. More rangers, more volunteers, search and rescue teams with dogs and thermal imaging equipment. They found a trail of disturbed vegetation leading away from the campsite, heading deeper into the gorge, where the terrain became increasingly rugged and inaccessible. The trail went cold after half a mile at a place where solid rock made tracking impossible, but nearby they discovered something that made even the most skeptical searchers go silent. A cave opening, partially hidden behind a fallen boulder and thick curtains of Virginia creeper. The entrance was narrow, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, but inside it opened into a larger chamber. The cave wasn't marked on any map, wasn't part of the known cave systems in Big South Fork. Someone, or something, had been using it. The floor was covered with organic debris, and against one wall, arranged with what looked like deliberate care, was a collection of objects that seemed to have been gathered over many years. There were bones, deer, elk, what might have been bear. There were pieces of camping equipment, a rusted lantern, sections of tent pole, a backpack so degraded by moisture and time that the fabric crumbled at a touch. There were more personal items, a hiking boot that might have once been teal and grey, a pair of eyeglasses with a cracked lens, a tarnished necklace with a pendant in the shape of a star. And there, tucked into a crevice in the cave wall as if placed there for safekeeping, was a driver's license in a waterproof plastic sleeve. The license belonged to Crystal Mays. The discovery of Crystal's license in that cave sent the investigation in a new direction. The forensic team processed the site as carefully as an archaeological dig, cataloguing every item, every bone, every scrap of evidence. Some of the objects were recent, placed within the last few months. Others were clearly years old, perhaps decades old, weathered and degraded but still identifiable. The boot was sent to the lab and compared to the one found near Becca Hartwell's car. A match, confirmed by wear patterns and a distinctive mark where the sole had been repaired with shoe glue. The eyeglasses were Becca's as well, identified by her prescription records. But Crystal's body wasn't in the cave. Neither was any evidence that she died there. The license was the only trace of her, as if someone had taken it from her purse and kept it, a token or a trophy, or simply something found and collected without understanding its significance. A behavioral psychologist brought in to consult on the case offered a theory that was both plausible and deeply unsettling. "Whatever is collecting these items," she said, studying the photographs from the cave, "is demonstrating complex behavior. This isn't random scavenging. There's selection happening, a preference for certain types of objects, personal items, things that might have emotional significance or simply tactile interest. And there's organization, objects arranged and stored rather than consumed or destroyed. This suggests intelligence, curiosity, maybe even a rudimentary understanding that these objects belong to someone." "Are you saying an animal is doing this?" Chen asked. The psychologist hesitated. "I'm saying that the behavior pattern suggests cognitive complexity beyond typical wildlife. Could be a person, someone living off-grid, perhaps mentally disturbed, collecting trophies or hiding evidence. Could be something else. I honestly don't know." Dale Pritchard spent 3 days camped near the cave with a team of researchers from the University of Tennessee's anthropology department. They set up camera traps, audio recorders, motion sensors. They worked quietly, trying not to disturb whatever presence might inhabit this area. On the second night, one of the audio recorders captured something that sent chills through everyone who heard it. The recording lasted 14 seconds. It began with the normal sounds of the forest at night, insects, a distant owl, the whisper of wind through leaves. Then a new sound emerged, deep and resonant, starting low and rising in pitch before cutting off abruptly. It wasn't a growl exactly, wasn't a roar, wasn't any vocalization the researchers could match to known wildlife. One of the anthropologists, a specialist in primate behavior, said it reminded her of great ape vocalizations she'd heard in Africa. Gorillas making threat displays or establishing territory, but lower in frequency, more powerful, and with tonal qualities that suggested a larger vocal chamber than any known primate. "If I didn't know better," she said, listening to the recording for the 5th time, "I'd say this was some kind of undocumented great ape. But there are no great apes in North America. There haven't been for millions of years. So either we're dealing with an escaped exotic animal that somehow survived in these mountains for decades, or—" She didn't finish the sentence, didn't need to. On the 3rd night, the cameras captured movement. 3 different angles, 3 different moments, all showing the same thing. A large shape moving through the trees near the cave entrance, too tall to be a bear, too broad to be human, moving with a fluid grace that seemed at odds with its massive size. The footage was brief, fragmentary, never quite showing a full view of whatever was there. Just glimpses. a shoulder passing between trees, a head turning, too high off the ground, silhouetted against the faint glow of starlight. A hand, or what might have been a hand, reaching out to push aside a branch, the appendage looking too long, too thick-fingered to be human. The research team left the next morning, not out of fear exactly, but out of a shared, unspoken understanding that they were intruding on something that deserved its privacy, its mystery. They took their footage, their recordings, their measurements and observations, and they wrote a report that was carefully neutral in its conclusions, acknowledging the evidence while refusing to speculate about its source. But privately, away from official channels and formal documentation, the lead anthropologist told Dale something that he never forgot. In indigenous traditions across North America, she said, there are stories about beings that live in the deep forests. Every culture has its own name, its own interpretation, but the core story is remarkably consistent. Large, bipedal, covered in hair, intelligent but not human. Most modern scientists dismiss these stories as folklore, misidentification of bears, or cultural memory of extinct megafauna. But what if the stories persist because there's truth in them? What if there's something living in the last wild places that we simply haven't documented because it's smart enough to avoid us, because it lives in the margins where humans rarely go? You think that's what this is? Dale asked. She looked at him for a long moment. I think the world is stranger than we allow ourselves to believe. I think there are gaps in our knowledge large enough to hide something extraordinary. And I think whatever is living in these mountains has been here much longer than we have. The investigation into Rebecca Hartwell's death was officially closed in the autumn of 2021. The Cumberland County Sheriff's Office issued a final report stating that Rebecca died as a result of head trauma sustained during an encounter with an unknown large animal, possibly a bear, possibly something else. The report noted the unusual evidence, the inconsistencies, the unanswered questions, but concluded that without a definitive suspect or conclusive forensic evidence, the case could not be prosecuted further. Derek Hollis's name appeared in the report as a person of interest who had been investigated and cleared. Crystal Mays remained missing. Her case stayed open, her family still hoping for answers that might never come. Detective Sarah Chen transferred to a position in Nashville in early 2022, leaving behind the mountains and the mysteries they held. But she kept copies of all the files, all the photographs, all the evidence that couldn't quite be explained by conventional means. Sometimes, late at night, she'd open those files and look through them, searching for patterns, for the piece of information that would make everything click into place and reveal a truth she could articulate. She never found it. Some truths, she came to understand, existed beyond the reach of police work and forensic science. Some truths lived in the space between what we can prove and what we know in our bones to be real. Dale Pritchard continued hiking the Cumberland Plateau well into his 70s. He never stopped looking, never stopped documenting, never stopped believing that there were answers out there if you knew where to search. His file on the Hartwell case eventually filled 3 large binders, hundreds of pages of notes and photographs, and carefully recorded observations. He gave lectures at regional conferences, wrote articles for small journals that specialized in the unexplained. Some people called him obsessed, others called him a crank. A few, the ones who'd been in those woods themselves and felt that watching presence, called him brave. In the spring of 2024, Dale made one final trip to Raven Point. He was 76 years old by then. His knees bothered him on the steep sections, but he still moved through the forest with the confidence of a man who'd spent a lifetime in wild places. He climbed to the overlook where Becca had once stood, where something had marked the stone with its claws, where his trail camera had captured that strange silhouette 20 years after she'd disappeared. He sat on the edge of the cliff, legs dangling over empty space, and looked out across the vast green expanse of the Cumberland forest. Spring was coming on strong, the trees leafing out in every shade of green imaginable, the air warm and full of bird song. It was beautiful, he thought, beautiful and ancient and utterly indifferent to human concerns. A sound made him turn. Something moving in the trees behind him, branches shifting, the soft compression of weight on forest duff. Dale's heart rate elevated, adrenaline sharpening his senses, but he didn't run. He'd spent too many years chasing this mystery to run now. The trees were dense, the shadows deep despite the afternoon sun. He couldn't see anything clearly, just shapes and movement, and the sense of something large observing him from the shelter of the forest. A smell drifted to him on the breeze. Musky, animal, not unpleasant, but wild in a way that made every instinct scream at him to be cautious. "I know you're there," Dale said quietly, his voice carrying across the overlook. "I've known for a long time. I don't want to hurt you. I don't want to expose you or chase you away. I just want to understand." The movement stopped. The forest went silent, that same heavy silence he'd experienced so many times over the years. Dale waited, barely breathing, wondering if this was finally the moment when the mystery would resolve itself, when he'd see clearly what had remained hidden for so long. A shape emerged from the shadows, tall, easily 7 feet, covered in dark hair that was almost black in the dim light beneath the canopy. It stood upright, bipedal, with broad shoulders and long arms, and a face that he couldn't quite make out in the distance and shadow. It didn't move toward him, didn't approach the cliff edge. It simply stood there, and Dale had the profound sense that it was studying him with the same intensity that he was studying it. They regarded each other for a long moment, the old man and the thing from the deep forest. Dale slowly reached for his camera, movements deliberate and non-threatening. He raised it, looked through the viewfinder, started to press the shutter. The shape turned and disappeared into the forest with a speed and silence that seemed impossible for something so large. One moment it was there, solid and undeniable. The next, nothing but shifting shadows and the whisper of disturbed branches settling back into place. Dale lowered the camera without taking the photograph. He sat there on the cliff edge for another hour as the sun moved west and the shadows grew long, thinking about Rebecca Hartwell and Crystal Mays and all the others who'd walked into these woods and never walked out. Thinking about mysteries that might be better left unsolved, creatures that had earned their privacy through centuries of caution and restraint. When he finally stood and hiked back to the trailhead, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not satisfaction exactly, not closure, but a kind of peace. He'd seen it. For just a moment, the gap between the known and unknown had narrowed to nothing, and he'd looked through to the other side. He never told anyone about that final encounter. The photograph he didn't take remained an empty frame in his memory, precious because it couldn't be shared or scrutinized or debated. It was his alone, proof of nothing and everything, the answer to a question he'd spent decades asking. The forests of the Cumberland Plateau continue their ancient rhythms, indifferent to human attempts to understand or categorize or explain. Hikers still walk the trails, most of them safe, most of them returning home, with nothing more dramatic than tired legs and photographs of scenic overlooks. But occasionally, in the deepest parts where the trees grow thick and the hollows echo with sounds that might be wind or might be something else, people report feelings they can't quite articulate. The sensation of being watched, the smell of something wild and musky on the breeze, footprints too large to belong to anything known, disappearing into terrain too rough for following. And sometimes, late at night when the fog rolls through the valleys, and the moon casts strange shadows through the canopy, residents of the small towns bordering the plateau hear sounds, deep, resonant vocalizations that carry for miles, echoing off cliff faces and rolling through the darkness like thunder. They close their windows, check their locks, and tell themselves it's just coyotes, just owls, just the wind playing tricks with acoustics and imagination. Most of them believe that. Most of them have to believe that. Because the alternative, that there are still places in America where something unknown lives and hunts and marks its territory, where the border between civilization and true wilderness remains as real and dangerous as it was centuries ago, is too unsettling to accept in an age when we believe we've mapped and measured and understood everything. But the forest knows better. The mountains know better. And the few who've walked far enough into the wild places, who felt that watching presence and seen the evidence left behind, they know better too. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Some creatures have earned the right to remain unknown, to exist in the spaces between certainty and doubt, real enough to leave their mark, but elusive enough to deny proof. And perhaps that's how it should be. Perhaps the world needs its wild edges, its question marks, its reminders that humanity doesn't have dominion over everything, that there are still powers older and stranger than our cities and our science and our need to categorize and control. Rebecca Hartwell walked into those woods on an October afternoon in 2004, and something happened that ended her life but allowed her mystery to endure. Her parents have passed on now. Her brother has aged into middle age, carrying the weight of unanswered questions. But her name remains, whispered on trails and in small-town diners, a cautionary tale and a puzzle and a story that refuses to fade. And somewhere in the green depths of the Cumberland Plateau, in caves where sunlight never reaches, and forests where human footprints are rare and temporary, something moves through the shadows, ancient and enduring, keeping its secrets as the years turn to decades and the world outside changes beyond recognition, while the wild places remain, constant and unknowable, exactly as they've always been. Was it predator or protector, animal or something more? Or does the answer matter less than the mystery itself? This story was a journey into the unexplained, a reminder that in America's vast wilderness there are still questions without answers, and perhaps some things are meant to remain beyond our understanding. The truth about what happened to Rebecca Hartwell may never be fully known, but her story lives on, haunting the forests of Tennessee and the imaginations of all who dare to wonder what lies in the shadows just beyond the trail.